Hi, good evening. This is a foreigner in the Philippines. Well, it's a late night, not really late night, 8 o'clock. Got my glasses on, so you know I'm going to read. This is, just warn you now, it's a 15-minute story. It's a short story that I wrote based on the life of my brother, who was quite a character. Anyway, this is called How to Steal a Double-Decker Bus. Neville looked at the bright red double-decker bus. It was a beauty, and the older type that needed a two-man team, a firm favourite of his. There was a separate cab for the driver, who sat in peace, undisturbed and separate from the passengers, tickets being issued by the conductor. That peace was later taken away by the improved design of the bigger buses, which gave the driver the additional job of issuing tickets from the open driving position. Nev sighed. It was a wish things could stay the same kind of sigh, as he looked again at his watch. He quietly cursed every passing taxi driver that ignored his wave from an already loaded taxi. He stood outside the pub from which he had received the call from the Manchester Royal Infirmary, where his wife Jean was having their first child. Clutching the brown teddy bear, he paced the sidewalk, watching in despair as taxi after taxi sped by with the "For Hire" sign on the roof turned off. The message from the midwife rang in his ears. "Get here fast or you'll miss the show." His sense of desperation was mounting. Looking again at the double-decker bus, he reflected on the path on which his life had taken him. He had escaped at 15 from a school system that was ignorant of the affliction of being dyslexic, that had labelled him stupid. Nev only knew that letters didn't behave for him like they seemed to behave for everyone else. They scattered about the page instead of forming into words and sentences. Sooner or later an employer would realize he could barely write his name, let alone fill in a simple form or invoice. Nev didn't stick around to explain something even he didn't understand, and he just walked away from job after job. Eventually he found his place and realized the dream of many a schoolboy. It was a job that even a new college graduate with a great future might secretly envy, and he proudly claimed the title of fireman on the footplate of a steam locomotive. The great fire-breathing giants of steam pulled long lines of carriages full of passengers the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. Nev would balance on the swaying footplate and shovel coal from the tender into the blazing furnace as the locomotive thundered along the tracks. Mr. Jeffries, the implacable driver, sat like a king, with one elbow out of the open window and his hand on the regulator. He held his pipe in his mouth with the other hand, and like Sherlock Holmes, he nodded his approval at his young fireman. Nev was in heaven. But that's another story. Another look at his watch told him that drastic action was needed. He offered a silent prayer for his impending sin with a promise to the Almighty, and he crossed the road to where the double-decker bus stood waiting. The two-man crew, who were presently enjoying an illegal tea stop in the nearby cafe, were in for a surprise when they returned to where they had parked their bus. They would no doubt look at each other in panic and wonder how on earth they could possibly explain back at the depot how they had managed to lose a double-decker bus. Nev reached up and slid open the door. Climbing up and into the cab, he adjusted the driver's seat to accommodate his longer legs, tweaked the rear-view mirror, and made himself comfortable. Slipping back in time, he went through the checklist. Off went the lights in the rest of the bus as he cranked on the overhead handle. Scrolling through the roll of canvas signs, he quickly found the "Out of Service" sign. He placed the brown teddy bear on the dash, a silent witness to the crime. He started the motor and released the handbrake. Just like old times, he thought, and smiled as he pulled the huge vehicle out into the traffic. Buses do not have ignition keys, as it is thought that nobody will steal a double-decker bus. Desperate, expectant fathers are now the exception to this rule. Nev sped down the long side road, way over the speed limit, but well aware that no bus has ever been pulled over by a cop. He had to smile at the angry, gaping mouth of the helpless bus inspector as he passed by, who was left behind at the roadside with his hand frozen aloft in an astonished wave. "I always wanted to do that," smiled Nev as he sped by, returning the wave with his own hand. At the infirmary maternity wing, he bumped the bus up the curb when he parked. Well, it had been a while, and he was in a hurry. Double yellow lines be damned. Into the wing he dashed in time to be told, "It's a girl." "That's okay," Nev told a bemused midwife, "as long as it's a baby." "Nice of you to drop in," a still feisty Jean told him in that caustic humour that passed back and forth on the mock battlefield they called their marriage. Any smart response Neville may have been about to deliver died on his lips, and the tears welled in his eyes as he was presented with his brand new daughter, Lynn. He cradled the tiny baby in his arms, amazed at hands and feet no bigger than his thumbs. His life as it had been up to that moment shattered and broke into a million pieces to instantly remake itself into something more wonderful. Looking down at this infant, he felt humbled. Here was a new life, a little mite who would depend on him for everything. In that moment, he knew this wasn't a job that he could walk away from. This was for a lifetime. Jean watched this man holding their child, with his broad shoulders shaking and tears falling into his young man's beard. She knew it was a moment that bonded them together like welded steel. She knew their life would have many challenges and hardships, and bring the promise of so much joy. She couldn't know that they would also have a son, Neil, who would be so much like his father, following him around like a puppy, adoring, copying, idolizing his father. His first word was "Dad," and it was on his lips so often Nev used to tease him. "Dad this, Dad that, Dad, Dad, Dad. I'm going to change my name, you'll see." Jean couldn't know that too soon the day would come when the Dark Angel would come to their door with the news that Nev had fallen, that his heart had stopped and he had died on the way to the hospital, hardly in his 50s. She couldn't know that their daughter Lynn, who loved her father as only a daughter can, would hold the grief in her broken heart like a clenched fist. Nor could she know how, at only 15, their son Neil would be so lost he would cry out bitterly in tears of pain and anger. How he would rage against a God who would rob them of such a good man as his dad, so early in his life. Right there in the hospital bed, Jean looked at her man and she knew only one thing. She would love him for the rest of her life. Neville, cradling the tiny form of Lynn, his heart pounding in his chest and bursting with emotion that was close to overwhelm. He was in awe at the miracle of the child he was holding and was at the mercy of a terrifying mixture of wonder and fear. Standing there with his child in his arms, he made a vow that no child on earth would have a better father. He laid the baby down in the arms of Jean and gazed at his wife. They had known each other from long before their teens. Her family had taken him in, given him a seat at their table and a place in their hearts, and he had never left. Jean was exhausted from the long labour and the birth. Her hair, still wet with perspiration, clung to her face, which had not a trace of makeup, but for Nev, no woman had ever looked so beautiful. At that moment, time and space, those guardians of the universe, agreed to look the other way. Counting, and the world stood still. Space closed in and wrapped around this newborn child with her newborn family in a cocoon of warmth and love. Nev bent over Jean and cupped her face tenderly in his calloused hands. With a tenderness that was new to them both, he kissed her gently, first on the forehead, then on the eyes, and lastly on her open mouth. And in a voice choked with emotion, he told her, "I love you so very much." "Oh, shut up, you soppy thing," she told him, shrugging him off even as she hid her smiling face. And so the spell was broken. Time and space returned to their posts, sheepish at being away for so long. The clock on the wall ticked a little louder as if to make up for lost time, and space allowed the room to open up as the world began to turn again. As Nev was leaving, Jane demanded, "Didn't you bring anything for the baby?" Nev clapped his hands to both pockets and turned to reveal his hapless face. In the voice of a scolded schoolboy begging forgiveness, he tried to explain. "I bought her a brown teddy bear, but I must have lost it." Jean, shaking her head in mock despair, admonished him. "You'd lose your bloody head if it wasn't screwed on." "Don't you worry about me, Chuck," Ned protested. "I've got my head screwed on." "Oh, really?" sniffed Jean, rolling her eyes to the ceiling. "Well, I think it could do with another turn." But the lines of engagement for the marriage had been forever redrawn, making way for a gentler love. Leaving the hospital for the wind-swept streets, Nev turned up his collar and stepped into the rain. He reached the sidewalk where the double-decker bus was still parked, with one wheel up on the curb. It was surrounded by police cars, and their flashing blue lights reflected on the canopy of the umbrellas of curious bystanders. Nev joined a group of nurses. "So, what's going on?" he asked one of the nurses. In a lowered voice, as if keeping a secret, she told him, "Well, don't you know, somebody stole this double-decker bus and left it here." Nev feigned shock. "Well, I never," he said, shaking his head. On the sidewalk near the bus stood a bepimpled policeman who looked young enough to have been late for school that morning. "So, what's going on?" repeated Nev as he joined the cop. Rocking on his heels and basking in the self-importance that comes with the uniform, PC Pimples ordered Nev, "Stand back there, please, sir." But then, in conspiratorial tones, delivered from the side of his mouth, he told Nev, "Can't say much, sir. The crime squad are still examining the scene." "Are there any clues?" persisted Nev. Lowering his voice even more, PC Pimples looked around as if to make sure that they were alone, and confided, "Well, the word is they think it might be the first in a series of crimes. The thief left what the experts believe in these cases may be the criminal's signature in the driver's cab." "Really? And what was that?" "On the dash they found a brown teddy bear," came the cryptic reply. "Well, I never," said Nev, shaking his head again. As the new dad walked home in the rain with a smile and a jaunty step, he reflected to himself, I should have brought a pink teddy bear anyway.